Okay, my name's Cameron Baker. I'm going to be talking about Russia, Ukraine, and the geopolitics of Crimea. Um, so, first thing we need to talk about is the fact that demography, geography, and history make Russia's interest in Crimea fairly unsurprising. Watching the news media when Russia decided to invade and then annex Crimea in early 2014, you kind of got the impression that it was unforeseen, very unpredictable, very surprising. But in reality, there are a lot of factors that point to this type of interest from Russia in Crimea. So 60% of the Crimean population is actually ethnic Russian. Russia owned Crimea for 200 years. It was conquered by Catherine the Great, and she called it the crown jewel of the Russian Empire. It wasn't until 1954 that the USSR actually gave Crimea to Ukraine, obviously not foreseeing that the Soviet Union would end up collapsing. They would kind of lose control of it. Most voting age Crimeans, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, favored remaining with Russia or becoming autonomous rather than continuing as part of the Ukraine. And finally, the other reason why it's fairly unsurprising that Russia has interest in the region is that Crimea is home to Russia's largest warm water naval fleet at Sevastopol. So, being interested in the region and deciding to annex it are two different things, obviously. So what is Russia's motivation in annexing Crimea? And obviously understanding that there were geopolitical costs to doing that. What made it worth it for Russia? So the first thing that we need to understand is that Russia's annexing Crimea is basically just an extension of a larger geopolitical strategy to regain the influence that the Soviet Union, or that Russia lost when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 20th century. So, in order to do this, Russia, understanding that the United States has been preoccupied in the Middle East ever since September 11th, and understanding that the United States' stated policy objective is to pivot to Asia. Russia understands it has a fairly long rope, and so they're basically using soft power tactics to kind of bully former Soviet bloc neighbors into going along with pro-Russian policies. They do this via propaganda. So Russian state media is buying companies, media companies in the Ukraine and other former Soviet bloc countries to promote a pro-Russian agenda. And then economically, Russia basically the countries like Moldova, Estonia, Ukraine, countries do not have very strong economies, and they're very heavily dependent on Russia. And so when these countries start to kind of drift towards the EU or NATO, they have to fear repercussions from Russia, including banning imports of Moldovan wine or things like that. And then finally, the biggest way that Russia kind of manipulates these countries is through energy policy. Russia is the largest provider of natural gas to Europe, and over almost 60% of European natural gas actually originates in Russia. So these countries' economies depend on Russian energy, and they really can't afford to confront Russia over its tactics because they don't want energy prices to go through the roof. Before the Ukraine's political upheaval and the kind of the drift towards the EU that predicated that political upheaval, Russia preferred that status quo to what they have now. Russia really did dominate the culture of Crimea, and had a lot of influence in the region without actually having to go annex it. So Russia preferred the status quo. However, once the risk existed that Crimea would become eventually inaccessible to Russia, with the Ukraine drifting more towards the EU, Russia needed to prove a point, and so it was deemed that intervention into Crimea was actually acceptable, even though it's not necessarily preferable to the alternative status quo. All right, so how should the West respond to all this? The reality is that Russia currently holds most of the cards. They are in the stronger of the two positions because not only is Europe over-reliant on Russian natural gas, but America is preoccupied with the Middle East and Asia still. So Russia realizes this. That's the reason why they are being more belligerent, and that's the reason why sanctions that we saw after Russia annexed Crimea were fairly mild. In order to counter this, the West strategy needs to include providing Europe with an alternative supply of natural gas. Fortunately, the United States is capable of doing this because of its large supplies of shale gas. The United States also needs to strengthen military and economic ties with Europe via NATO and the European Union to provide these former Soviet bloc countries with an alternative to kind of receding back to Russian domination. And then finally, the United States and kind of Western allies can counter Russian propaganda by providing free radio and more liberal democratic alternatives in Eastern Bloc countries to provide a competition for the pro-Russian media. All of this should be done under the understanding that this strategy is not going to be short-term. It's going to be long-term in nature, and is not going to happen overnight. So that's Russia, Ukraine, and the geopolitics of Crimea. Thanks.